back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And joining us once again is Professor Richard Wolff. I always look forward to speaking with him. He is the co-host of he's the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV Tuesday evenings. He is the author of a number of books, including The Sickness is the System. His latest, he's a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, professor, I believe, visiting professor at NYU. And we always appreciate talking. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here.
I thought we would do something a little different this time. You and I have been talking a great deal, I suspect, about some of the same topics, and they're important topics: climate change, war in Ukraine, economic uncertainty and inequality. But if you don't mind, I thought we would take a little bit of a different angle this time, because I feel as if many of us need a kind of reset, whether you think of it as therapy or as, reflection and insight or whatever. But I wanted to get your thoughts. I mean, maybe we can get to economic headlines if we have time, but I really wanted to get your thoughts on some quotes I pulled, just to mention them and see what you think and see where that takes us. Does that sound okay?
Absolutely. Let's go for it.
All right. Well, the first quote is from the late psychotherapist James Hillman. I don't know if you're familiar with James Hillman's work, but he tried very hard to link therapy with real world conditions, and also with philosophical and Jungian and other ideas. But this is the quote from James Hillman. And it may be as I start to tell these quotes, you'll understand why I was driven to recall them as we live through current events. Hillman's quote: "The soul of our civilization depends upon the civilization of our soul. The imagination of our culture calls for a culture of the imagination."
Wow. Well, let me tell you where I'm coming from before I even give you my response.
Okay.
I am married for all my adult life to a psychotherapist. And so everything that she has taught me over my lifetime has really shaped much of my thinking, even though I was always focused on politics and economics and history and so forth. So I really appreciate the efforts that quotations like that make to capture an enormously complicated reality and whittle it down to a few precious words. I want to pick up particularly on the word imagination, that last key word. For me, imagination has to do with being able to use phrases, to put yourself in another person's shoes, to allow your mind to imagine different scenarios, alternative perspectives or understandings of a given scenario, remembering that it may be given, but it's given differently to all of us, since we all have different ways of thinking about the world we encounter. And so my reaction is to express, if you don't mind, my frustration at living at a time when we are not only not encouraged to have an imagination and to let it blossom, but we are systematically surrounded with efforts to constrict and constrain the way we think, not to see alternative perspectives. I mean, war has always done that. There is that famous quote that the first casualty in every war is the truth, because the warring parties are so tempted to tell a story in which they are the good and the other side is the evil, one way or the other. And I feel that living in the United States today, even to the point where it is downright childish. For me, let me put it this way. I think there's an open-mindedness and an imaginative way of thinking on the one hand, and then there is the narrow, lopsided way of thinking that I call advertising. When an advertiser works or speaks, the advertiser's job is to sell whatever his client pays him to sell. And so communication, visual, verbal, whatever form it takes, is all about highlighting and stressing whatever's good about that product that the advertiser is selling, and to minimize or simply ignore or grossly lie about all the negative. There's nothing balanced about it. Its premise is not balanced. Its mode of functioning is not balanced. And the outcome is a narrow, lopsided, externally driven assessment of whatever the topic is. For me, it's the exact opposite of what an education is supposed to enable people to do, to weigh the pros and cons, to look at the different ways one can think about or relate to an object. So advertising is the narrow dumbing down of a population, a direct product of capitalism, which has developed the industry of advertising on a scale and in a way the world had never seen before. It makes the effort of regimes, even of religions, to control how people think look like crude, early primitive examples, which the hyping of advertising has brought to an absurd perfection. And for me, the call of that quotation, to think imaginatively, to allow yourself to open up to all the possibilities, is a wonderful antidote to what is the norm in the culture.
I love that answer. It resonates with my own feelings about why I picked the quote. And though I hadn't planned to, I'll throw in another quote off the top of my head from the poet Diane de Prima. And Diane de Prima wrote, "There is a war for the imagination. The only war that matters is the war against the imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it. Nobody can fight it for you. Nobody can fight it but you."
Right. No. It couldn't be more timely. Absolutely. It is a war to, well, let me give you an example from today that you could have pulled from the Wall Street Journal today, too. One of the most respected polling operations of the American people to gather what people think about the economic conditions they're in and what they think they're going to face economically over the next 6, 12, 18 months. It's called the Survey of Consumers, and it is undertaken by the University of Michigan. There's a whole department there in Ann Arbor that does this, and they've been doing it since, I believe, the mid-1940s. I think it started right toward the end of World War II. So it's been going a long time, 75 years or more, and they do regular polling. So they really have a track record, not only of understanding what people are thinking, et cetera, but watching it move. Okay, they released a few days ago their latest survey. And here's what it shows. A year ago, March 2021, the consumers of America polled, gave answers as to what they thought their financial conditions were. And there's an index that they use to measure it. And that index was about 80, roughly 80. And then they measured it this last couple of weeks, and it was 50. I mean, these are round numbers. but it gives you an idea. This is a very unusual, spectacular drop in that amount of time of the index of how people would assess their own economic/financial situation. Another question that the same survey asks the same people is, what do you think is going to happen to your economic financial position over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months? And there, 32% believed it would deteriorate over that time from the low level it already is. And according to the University of Michigan survey, that is the worst index of what people expect to be living through that has ever been recorded by their survey. All right. The mass of the American people, therefore, can be said to be, how shall I put it, grim-faced about their economic condition, grim-faced about what has happened to it over the last year, and grim-faced about what's lying ahead. Fast forward, the latest speech on the economy by President Biden, we are in a robust recovery. All right? I don't know what to say, it takes my breath away. The leading politician is telling us something which the people who vote for him in the past, who will be voting for his party in a few months, see the world in an utterly different way based on their lived experience. Now, sure, I know that every president in power says the economy is good, and as soon as he's out of power, says the economy isn't good, and that's the fault of whoever he's running against. They all do that. Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. It's pathetic, but none of them have ever, in my experience, been as divorced from reality as the current Mr. Biden in his desperate effort to hold on to the power he has. And I am, of course, no fan of Mr. Trump and no fan of Mr. Putin or anybody else. These people are all, for me, the same thing. But it does strike me that the war of the politician is what Diane de Prima says. It's a war on the consciousness, on the imagination, on the spirit, on the inquiring mind of the mass of people. That we have a politics that is designed to fool you. It's like an advertiser trying to sell you a really bad product and therefore having to go to even greater extremes over time to cover over all the defects and to manufacture a fake reality for fear of what might happen if the actual reality was also representable in our conversation and in our talking with one another. And I think that De Prima is absolutely right. In the end, that's the struggle.
She also said, by the way, there is no way out of a spiritual battle. There is no way you can avoid taking sides. And it seems to me that this process of, materials may challenge the use of the word spiritual, but it certainly in the sense that some people use it, whether you want to say spiritual, ethical, visionary, there is no way you can avoid taking sides. It seems to me that one of the diseases of our time is the pandemic of people not wanting to take sides or not wanting to take them deeply or too fiercely. What do you think?
Absolutely. There is nothing but taking sides. There is no lofty position beyond the taking of sides that can resolve them. It's one of the hardest lessons I have to teach my students, that everything they're reading, every book, every assemblage of data. I'm an economist, so every statistical theory, every mathematical model in my business is very, very partisan. It's full of partisan assumptions, partisan logics, and partisan conclusions. That's not a reason to reject them, because that's all we've ever had. We've never had the mirage of an objective analysis of things. And for me, objective is the word we come up with when we feel the partisanship of everything, and we would like to understand, or at least to imagine, the possibility of something other than partisanship. And so we imagine what it's like. It's like, it's very similar to recognizing, if I can be so bold, that we are all going to die. Every single one of us. And this haunts us. It's a frightening kind of thing. And so we imagine, because that's all we can do, something other than or beyond death, an immortality. The very concept of immortality is a concept you only develop when you are hounded by your mortality, and your mind wants to kind of go a little further, which I applaud that. That's very interesting, as long as you remember what it is you're doing.
And all right, let me give you another quote. I think you will recognize it. I'm curious to know if it fits into the flow of our conversation or not. But the quote is, "The less you are, the more you have." Recognize it?
No.
It's attributed to Marx. It may be a bad translation, but the argument that he was trying to address some kind of, whether it's Hegelian or other notion that that you, in working, in fulfilling your societal role as a worker, or I suppose as a student, are sacrificing more and more of yourself, so that the more you become, the less you have.
Right. No, for me, it does suggest the marvelous section early in volume 1 of Capital. I teach Marx's Capital, and I have for many, many years. It's called, very famous, it's called The Fetishism of Commodities. It's early in volume 1. And Marx there, in an aside, which has entranced thinkers for many decades, Marx goes about and explains that markets as an institution, unlike many other institutions human beings have created, have been so powerful that they have reacted back upon the people who created them, to make them imagine that it's not we who create and use a market to distribute things amongst ourselves, but that somehow the market shapes us. They got it confused. And so Marx reminds us, explicitly, by the way, that we are making the mistake of the story by Mary Bysshe Shelley, the Frankenstein story of the monster. Notice the use of the monster as the parallel. We create a monster who then dominates us, so long as we forget that we created this thing. And if we created it, we have all kinds of means to undo it, to modify it, and everything else. And the same thing with markets. So if you listen to discourse among politicians in this society, and above all, the really weird ones called libertarians, they actually attribute agency to the market that they wish us all to subordinate ourselves to. They make statements like, let the market decide. That's a little bit like saying to your child, let the tricycle decide, when this is going to give the kid a complex. The tricycle hasn't got a brain. Right. The tricycle is a product of us, not our dominator. But if you get really lost in the ideology of capitalism, then you misunderstand objects created by people or institutions created by people as if they had an independent agency that you could somehow never challenge and simply accommodate or adapt to. That's the ideology of capitalism. It's the way that the capitalists get away with being responsible because they have the intermediation of this institution that people can then criticize, only to be told by the good servants of capitalism, the libertarians, oh, no, this is the market. This is nobody doing anything. This is an abstract thing. If I can be nasty for a moment, it's a little bit like folks in the Middle Ages explaining feudal lords doing horrible things to their serfs, but explaining that they were simply following Jesus's mandates or the church's mandates. This was a game that people had to learn to see through when they figured out finally that this religion was something they could redesign, recraft, and then you had the Protestants breaking from the Catholics and all the rest. So anyway, it's very powerful.
Yes, very powerful. And, my only criticism is not really a criticism, but I think in singling out the libertarians, you may be inadvertently being too generous to the so-called centrists and moderates, who absolutely do the same thing, in my view anyway, who portray, I love this notion of the tricycle that decides where it wants to go, who basically say, well, we're technocrats, we're wonks, we just look at the facts and numbers, and they tell us that we have to decimate the middle class or promote poverty or whatever. Well, it's not us doing it, it's the numbers doing it. Reminds me of the Eloi in H.G. Wells' Time Machine, the very few, very privileged who lived in the garden while the workers, the Morlocks, lived underneath. And they were always, we don't know how it happens. It's just a lovely world that we live in. I feel as if too much of our civilization, particularly the privileged people in it, are living like the Eloi.
And the irony of the quote is, the more you give credence to all of that, the more you become trapped by your own narrowness in doing that, by forgetting that these institutions are created by us. You deny the community the capacity and the logic of making changes in institutions, even though the market becomes the major institution in Western history only through struggle against the earlier modes of distribution. Most of the history of the human race, it did not live with markets. The markets is a particular institution to which people, and you're right, the libertarians in a way shouldn't be singled out by me because they're just formalizing, they're taking it to the next step, something that the people who use that kind of mentality don't even have the capacity to see the logic that the libertarian kind of puts front and center to make the whole thing philosophical. But I think that these are crucial understandings to break the world out of its narrow notion. I mean, I don't mean to bring in the immediate situation, but in a way, your questions bring us to it. The left is looking at a world full of conflict and war among fighters, none of whom have anything to do with what the left is trying to create, go beyond capitalism. I feel as though we're back to the end of the 19th century when there was an enormous left, as there is now, critical of capitalism, as there is now, very creative in how it understood all of that, as it is now, but with no champion to focus on. World War I is a war of competing capitalist empires. Lenin's pamphlet on imperialism lays that out. I mean, and many other things do too, but he all understood it. We didn't have anybody to line up against. We had to be critical of everybody. What distinguished Mr. Lenin, what distinguished Eugene Victor Debs in this country was they got up and they said it. This is not our war, and working men and women shouldn't participate in it. Lenin's position for Russia, Debs's position. Debs was put in jail because he said it. Lenin was exiled to Switzerland because he said it, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, here we are again. Once again, no champion. Russia gave up what it was trying to do. It is now a self-declared capitalist country. China has more private capitalists in it today than at any time since the revolution of 1949. We have capitalist empires, one declining, the one we live in, one emerging, the Chinese, and the world, like, in an earthquake, the tectonic plates are bumping against each other. Poor Ukraine is in the wrong place at the wrong time, so the bump happens there. But for us, the need is to say, we got to go somewhere very different from where all these players have come to, because here again, capitalism is working its way yet again to another world war. And the only amazing thing is, with more or less of the same countries lining up to do it.
And we're all innocents at play in this garden, or so many of us are, of the Eloi. And I'm thinking again of another quote from James Hillman, and I'll put it in context for in a sentence afterwards. But he said, "I'm the result of upbringing, class, race, gender, social prejudices, and economics. So I'm a victim again, a result." And what he was really saying, I think, was all these forces have shaped him. And while he lived in a more privileged position than the vast majority of the human race here and around the world, I think what he was saying, to the extent that I let these externalities define me and limit my autonomy, I'm a victim of this system, however well it treats me, even if it feeds me in the garden like the Eloi. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely. And, again, this is a mountainously important topic, because what it does is it dresses down, it challenges, it imaginatively becomes doubtful of the illusion that we are, quote unquote, self-made men or self-made women. We are products, and not only products of our past, but products of our present, and the self-delusion that, quote unquote, I chose, as if there's some I that exists independent of all those forces he lists and the many more that you could. We are all products. Whatever individuality we have, whatever uniqueness we have, is a product of the particular. Your mother is not my mother. Your experience in school is different from mine. All of the experiences of my life make me different, but not different because I have some intrinsic uniqueness. I don't make choices, or to put it differently, when I think I'm making choices, it doesn't take my wife, for example, a psychotherapist, doesn't take her more than 6 or 7 seconds to begin to point out to me all of the factors that made me choose in the particular way I did. And the idea that I can say, no, this is an original choice of mine, all that elicits from her is a kind but somehow piercing laughter.
Well, if we have time for one more quote, then
please,
I want to, and it comes from Piotr Kropotkin, who, by the way, as philosophers and voices go, may have been the first one to open my eyes to a lot of interconnectedness of modern or industrial age living. But and this will be our final quote. Kropotkin said, "Struggle so that all may live this rich, overflowing life, and be sure that in this struggle you will find a joy greater than anything else can give."
Yeah, I read Kropotkin fairly often. I go back to the books on my shelf. And the irony is not so much for his elaboration and celebration of anarchism. Interesting that is for me. But because he was a fierce critic of capitalism and did wonderful work explaining it and analyzing it, he was a remarkable fellow. But I vibrate to that quotation. You know, even though my parents were immigrants and came to this country with next to nothing, I have had, you know, extraordinary opportunities, mostly to be accounted for by being in the in the right place at the right time, more than anything else. And so I got a fancy education, and I got it at the fancy institutions, and that gave me access to jobs all my life. But, you know, I am acutely aware of the dependence of all of the things I've been able to do on accident, on the circumstances, and then having been able, which I did, and I'm grateful, having been able to find my way to be a social critic, I couldn't but echo what he said. I've never regretted it for a minute. I've spent most of my adult life being a critic of capitalism and an advocate for the proposition that we can do better than capitalism, and the human race can and should get to work doing that. Have I lost opportunities as a result? Absolutely. But the benefits I got, the relationships, the activity, the sense of achievement, the sense of citizenship, the sense of being meaningful in the world, I wouldn't trade that for anything. That has been, I'm glad I'm a teacher. It's a profession I didn't understand when I got into it, but I'm grateful that I did. And the process of fighting for social change, yeah, best thing that I could have done. And I would urge people watching or listening, don't make a mistake. We may bellyache from time to time, but that's one decision I made and people like us make, and there are no regrets there, none at all.
William Butler Yeats said education is the lighting of a fire, not the filling of a pail. So we'll end on that note. But Richard Wolff, economist, professor, host of Economic Update, and author of The Sickness is the System. As always, a great pleasure speaking with you. Welcome back, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you again, and I look forward to resuming our biweekly get-togethers.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.